Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, depending where you are. On behalf of the Asia Society Policy Institute, we'd really like to welcome you to this morning's webinar on countering economic coercion and tools and strategies for collective action. Today, we're going to delve into one of the most pressing and really growing challenges on the international scene, which is economic coercion, which threatens global economic growth, it threatens the rules-based trading system, and frankly, threatens global security and stability. While difficult to precisely define, as in many respects, you kind of know it when you see it, economic coercion consists of actions or threats thereof taken to punish countries, particularly smaller and medium-sized countries with less leverage, to achieve foreign policy objectives. And these coercive practices can take many forms, including import restrictions, export bans, tourist restrictions, and even consumer boycotts. In recent years, we've witnessed the increasing use of coercive measures, particularly by China. And we've seen these measures all around the globe, including in Korea, Australia, Taiwan, and Lithuania. And as these measures have become more widespread, countries have started taking actions to mitigate their impact, both on a national basis, but also internationally as well. In the US, our Congress has been quite active on this front. Congress has recently directed the White House through legislation to establish an interagency economic coercion task force. And earlier this month, a bipartisan bill submitted by Senator Chris Coons and Todd Young reintroduced an earlier bill to provide support to U.S. partners and allies facing economic pressure and retaliation from foreign adversaries. And last week, the House companion bill to the Senate bill was introduced. Japan, who hosts the G7 this year, has put this matter on its agenda for deliverables. And it looks to build on last year's statements coming out of the G7, where the seriousness and the challenges of this issue was flagged. And likewise, Korea, Australia, Japan, and others are taking steps to diversify their trading partners to decrease their vulnerability to economic coercion. With these developments in mind, this morning we plan to explore the potential avenues for tackling the challenge of economic coercion, focusing on collective action. And our distinguished panel of experts will discuss policy approaches that can be pursued to deter and respond to such coercion, including through international institutions. Now on to our program and our speakers. We're honored to have an impressive group with us this morning. Victor Cha is Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea at CSIS. He's a professor at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, my alma mater. And prior to joining CSIS, he served as Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, where I had the opportunity to work with him closely. Melanie Hart serves as a Senior Advisor for China and the Indo-Pacific in the Office of Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and Environment, Jose Fernandez. And in this role, she coordinates with other countries in addressing economic coercion around the globe. She also coordinates China's strategy at the State Department. And prior to joining the State Department, she served as a Senior Fellow and China Policy Director at the Center for American Progress, where we had the fortune of working together. Ryuichi Funatsu now serves as the Director for Economic Security Policy Division at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he's the point person on economic coercion at the ministry. Prior to this current post, he served as counselor at the Cabinet Secretary and also was here at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. for a few years working on trade matters. And finally, we're lucky to have Mariko Togashi, who is a research fellow for Japanese security and defense at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, where she's joining us from London. She's an expert on Japan's economic security and has an illustrious career before that, including, we learned, an early internship at CSIS. These four experts are going to bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to the discussion. I'll start and get in right with the questions, but towards the end of the program, we'll be inviting questions from the audience. So I urge you to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A box as soon as they come to mind. So let's start. Melanie, over to you first. Why is economic coercion such a problem? And what are your thoughts on the role that collective measures can play in countering this challenge? And anything you can share with us about what the administration has been doing in this area recently, since I understand you're on the forefront of such discussions. Over to you, Melanie.
Great. So thank you, first of all, for having me. Glad to be here, and particularly glad to be here with Japanese colleagues who are playing such an important leadership role on this issue in the G7 in particular. First of all, I think it's important to level set and share that from a US government perspective, our rules-based order requires that individual nations be free to make their own sovereign decisions in their own interests. If there are nations in the system that are using trade relationships, investment relationships to coerce other nations to make decisions that are not in their interest, or to not make decisions that are in their interests, in our view, that undermines US national security and the rules-based global order. So we view it as a top strategic priority to respond to economic coercion when it occurs, and to create space for sovereignty, to create space for leaders around the world to make decisions and take actions that benefit the people who elected them to power, not to the benefit of any individual nation state that is using trade for coercive measures. We see Russia doing this with energy. We see China doing this to pursue its own political interests globally. And this is a big concern for the United States. We are taking action on multiple fronts. First, from a longer term perspective, we are working with all of our partners to increase supply chain diversification, resilience, and security. One thing that the COVID epidemic taught us is that a single point of failure in our supply chains will always be a risk, particularly in our sectors of the supply chain that we can't afford to have delays. That applies also for economic coercion. The more we are all diverse, the more we have a diverse array of trading partners and sources of investment, the less we are all vulnerable to any one partner using our trading relationships against us. That's the longer term play. We are also working to do rapid response to support allies and partner nations who are facing economic coercion and need immediate assistance to survive that. And just to share an example, you mentioned Lithuania. The US government has been very active in directly working with Lithuania to support them as they have stood up to PRC bullying over their decision to open a Taiwanese representative office in their own capital. Just to share some of the things that the US government has done with Lithuania, we stood with them and supported them when they filed a case at the WTO opposing China's market distorting, rules breaking, coercive measures. When the PRC canceled around $300 million in export credits for Lithuanian companies as a means to punish them over their government's decision to allow the opening of a Taiwanese office in their own capital, we stepped in with the US Exim Bank to offer a $600 million alternative. The US DoD signed a bilateral defense procurement agreement with Lithuania. The US Commerce Department held multiple business-to-business meetings to help connect US companies with Lithuanian companies and do the matchmaking needed to replace and build new relationships to replace some of what Beijing was pulling back. The end result of all of this engagement is that Lithuania has replaced the gap that the PRC made in their trading relationship with diversification to other partners. Today, Lithuania's exports are less than 0.5% dependent on the PRC, and they have deepened and diversified their trading relationships throughout Asia. Many U.S. embassies and posts played a role in that. We were thrilled to work together with our Lithuanian counterparts to help them make some of those new relationships. We view that as a success because what it is a nation thriving in the face of coercion and maintaining the space to make its own sovereign decisions. Just briefly, in terms of thinking about how to maximize collaboration and collective response going forward, the way that the US looks at this, what we're looking for is a jazz band rather than an orchestra. Every scenario is going to be different because every nation has different trade relationships with the PRC, with Russia, and therefore different vulnerabilities that those nations may seek to exploit. That means our response needs to be flexible. It needs to be tailored to an individual scenario, and different countries are going to have different tools and capabilities that we can bring to bear in any one coercive scenario. You know, in the Lithuania case, some of the biggest, as I mentioned, some of the biggest opportunities that Lithuania was able to create was the diversification of its trade relationships in Asia and beginning to export to new partners in Asia. So our Asian partners played a critical role there. The United States had different critical roles that we were able to play as well. Every nation is going to have different unique tools that it can contribute, and we're looking for collective options that really leverage that diversity. So look forward to more of the discussion and turn it over to others from here. Thanks.
Okay, well, you put a lot on the table. We're going to follow up on some of those points. Victor, now over to you. So Melanie has outlined some of the things the administration is doing, and you, in a recent Foreign Affairs article, you put forward kind of a new idea called collective resilience. And it's almost, the way I interpret it to mean is kind of a bringing all these countries together to kind of try and coordinate and do the same thing in order to deter or to respond to economic coercion. But perhaps you can, I don't know if that's accurate, but maybe you can explain to us why such a mechanism is something worth considering. Over to you, Victor.
Sure, thanks, Wendy. Thanks for having me as part of this very distinguished group. The trade space is not my regular field of play, as you know, but this came about just based on some data we were looking at. So a couple of points. The first is, I would agree entirely with you that China's economic coercion is a real problem, and it's not just a threat to the liberal trading order, it's a threat to the liberal international order, as you said, because these actions are not based in law, they're not transparent, they're non-WTO conforming, and they're forcing countries either to make choices or not make choices about things that have nothing to do with trade. They have to do with things like democracy in Hong Kong, human rights in Xinjiang, a whole variety of different things. I think all the things that Melanie laid out are all very important. The focus on economic security, trade diversification, impact mitigation, resilience, supply chain, friendshoring and reshoring, these are all important. The argument that I made in Foreign Affairs comes essentially in at saying that in addition to these other actions to mitigate the impact of China's economic coercion, we also need something to try to deter the coercion, because we can use resilience and diversification and mitigation to respond to the coercion. In security terms, that's defense, but we also need to do something that's a little bit more on the offensive side to try to deter, to stop them from considering the use of economic coercion. And so this idea of collective resilience accepts that protection of supply chains is important. It accepts that decoupling completely from China is not feasible. And so we need to come up with something else to deter. And the basic idea behind it is that even though every country in the world, every economy in the world is asymmetrically dependent with China in terms of trade, interdependence still is a two-way street. And that there is data that shows that many of the countries that China has coerced, and I count 16 plus Taiwan, since 2008 that China has economically coerced. Many of these countries also export things to China that China is highly dependent on. In fact, the proportion we use is more than 70% dependent on. So for example, of the 16 countries that China has economically coerced, they export 406 items to China that China is more than 70% dependent on. And in addition to that, the second, third, and fourth suppliers of those high dependence goods, more often than not, tend to be other partner countries. So for example, one very quick example, Japan exports silver powder to China. Silver powder is an intermediary good used for solar panels. China is more than, I think, 80% dependent on Japan for that. The next source for China for silver powder is the United States, right? So there, in terms of substitutability, some of these products are hard for China to substitute for. Other examples, since we talked about the G7, if you cut the data along G7 countries, there are 403, G7 countries plus Australia, because for obvious reasons. There are 403 items that China, high dependence items that China is more than 70% dependent on. So the point of all this is not to try to start a trade war, but to say that there is leverage that these coerced countries have with regard to trying to deter Chinese economic coercion. And simply the threat of some sort of collective action, a Article 5 for collective economic deterrence, if you will, is something that, if it can be credible, is something that could potentially raise the costs when China contemplates such economic coercion. I admit that it's not easy to put together an Article 5 for collective economic deterrence. It requires a lot of credibility. It requires underwriting by lead powers. It requires preparing your domestic publics for this sort of action. But in the end, resilience and mitigation are important. But we also need to find a way to deter or to stop Chinese economic bullying, Chinese weaponization of interdependence. So let me leave it there.
Very interesting. And just a quick follow-up. And that would be, well, let me just clarify something. So you're suggesting, given all this leverage, that maybe this group of countries basically threatens to either cut off the trade with China or to raise tariffs against China, correct?
Yeah, I mean, something along those lines. And it would be, you know, I understand that would be very difficult to get, like if we took the G7 countries, it would be very difficult to get them to all say, all 403 items will act on if China uses economic coercion against any member of the group or anybody else. But you could put something together where there could be certain items. You could pick certain items that each country would threaten to potentially do something with. And you know, you'd pick items that are valuable to China, for which there's low substitutability and there's high dependence. And you might be able to put together a coalition like that, that would be a more credible signal than expecting, you know, all countries to sanction all 403 items.
Good. So just one criticism that I've heard from some of our trading partners to something like this, not your specific proposal, is a reluctance to kind of raise tariffs against, you know, China or an offending, you know, coercive power, with the view that if you're trying to preserve the rules-based trading system by taking an action like raising tariffs or putting in a ban in, you're breaking the rules that you're trying to preserve. How would you respond to that argument?
Yeah, so I would have two responses. The first is that you know, these I admit that these are illiberal practices, right? Not in conformity with the liberal trading order. But I don't see these as trade actions. I see them as pure competition. And pure competition, unfortunately, as we knew during the Cold War, sometimes is illiberal. The second response is that the purpose of this is not to actually use the action, but to threaten it. It's just like in security with deterrence. We don't threaten deterrence to start a war. We threaten it to prevent a war. And in this sense, this is meant to try to stop the weaponization of interdependence that China has been doing. So it's actually meant to try to preserve the liberal trading order, not to actually try to undermine it. And third, this strategy will be successful if it doesn't have to be used. I mean, again, it's just like security deterrence. If you have to fight the war, then you failed in terms of deterrence. And so you do everything you can to make this as credible and as signal as credible a strategy as possible, so that China will be deterred from acting. And you will never have to actually use this, but you will bring together a coalition that is credible.
Got it. Okay, now over to Funatsu-san. You're now working hard in the lead up to Japan's G7 leaders meeting, I believe this May, which is right around the corner. Can you give us a sense of how this matter will be addressed in the G7 and how you intend to kind of move the ball forward from last year's G7, when there was mention of economic coercion, but in very general terms, in the G7 statement?
Yes, thank you so much, Wendy, first of all, for hosting this important event and for having me in this panel discussions. So like you said, we are the host of Hiroshima G7 Summit this year in May, and we are working hard day and night, regardless of the time differences. And yes, the economic security is said to be one of the important items to be discussed at the leaders' meeting. And like you said, in the Elmau summit last year, back in June 2022, there's a pretty general but robust language addressing this issue, saying that leaders will increase our vigilance to threats, including economic coercion, that are meant to undermine global security and stability. To the same, we'll pursue enhanced cooperation and explore mechanisms to improve assessment, preparedness, deterrence, and the response to such risks, drawing upon best practice address exposure both across and beyond G7. This is pretty much a clear guideline from our point of view to make progress at the upcoming summit this year. I'm not supposed to go into the details of the discussion we are having right now, but still we are, based on this language, we are advancing our discussion with the G7 members, and we'll see how it's gonna work. And also, along with the G7 efforts, we've been advancing a discussion with like-minded countries bilaterally, especially with the United States, to see what kind of cooperation we could have to address economic coercions. And yes, and in doing so, we are pretty much paying close attention to the discussions being made in the academic circles, think tanks like Asia Society and IISS and others that are coming up with pretty interesting ideas to address issues. So, so yes, that's basically where we are. And I'll turn it over back to you. Thank you.
And maybe I can just follow up. So the G7 obviously is your focus, but you did mention that you're looking at, other international institutions as well. Do you think like the OECD or the WTO or APEC, have a role to play with respect to countering economic coercion?
Yes, thank you very much for asking me that question as well. Obviously, like Dr. Chow pointed out, that we have to be based on the sort of international economic order. In that sense, the WTO is supposed to be at its core. And also there should be roles for international organizations like OECD to play a role in raising international awareness in addressing issues like economic coercion as well. I I pretty much read with interest the report published by Asia Society back in 2021. There are quite a bit of policy suggestions, like suggesting OECD to make an inventory of economic coercion. That type of idea is pretty interesting from my point of view. At least this is only me speaking, but those kind of ideas could be, like interesting idea to explore. But it's up to, of course, our member country to discuss that type of ideas as well. But I believe that there are rooms for international organizations to play a role in addressing economic coercion.
Thank you. Okay, Mariko, over to you. Given the implications of economic coercion for many Indo-Pacific countries, and I think that Victor mentioned, like, in recent years, there have been 16 countries plus Taiwan that have been targets of Chinese coercion. I would just add, those are the countries we know about. And I'm sure Victor, like me, through our informal discussions, we hear other things where, like, people are just saying, you don't even know what's going on with us. I can't even tell you. So my question for you is, like, what's your perspective on all of this as you look at economic security issues? How has Japan dealt with these types of issues? And, what are the implications just more generally for medium and small countries in the region? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for first of all, for having me today. It's truly my honor to be here. So I think the example that Japan faced economic coercion is a good example is that it's in 2010 when China put export control on rare earth over the Senkaku Island disputes. And since then, Japan's dependence on China has fallen from around 90% to around 60% in around 10 years. As a result of developing technology to reduce the amount used in the manufacturing process. So I think not just diversifying, and of course those are important too, and financial support, but also sharing these knowledge can help in a lot of cases, is what I think. And I think, what Japan is focusing right now on is on the preventative side of economic coercion. So using Japan's key concepts of economic security to keep increasing strategic autonomy and strategic indispensability is the key. And in case some of you might not be familiar, strategic autonomy means to achieve security goals without excessive dependence on other countries, which will theoretically decrease the items that can be used for economic coercion. And strategic indispensability is to expand and strengthen the areas that other countries rely on, which gives the country a leverage to use the choke point. So to work on these is critical. But given the economic size, given the capacity of any one country, achieving a complete strategic autonomy is impossible for any country. So hence the argument of collective response, like we've just discussed. And country level effort is, of course, important, but given the limitation, I think achieving strategic autonomy with like-minded countries is critical. I'll stop there.
Okay, maybe then I can just follow up, and maybe Melanie, let me turn to you. I think Victor raised a good point, and that is the importance of deterrence and signaling to China or any other potential country that is thinking of economic coercive measures, that there's going to be a real cost if you go ahead, with such measures. You eloquently stated all the things that we've offered to help Lithuania, but what I didn't hear in any of that was, like, what steps are we taking to kind of get at the country that's doing the coercion? The assistance and support side to the target country, extremely important. But how would you respond to kind of Victor's view that we really need a strong deterrent like we have in the military security area?
Sure. So I think it's important to keep in mind the differences between economic coercion scenarios and military conflict. They're really quite different contexts. And the NATO Article 5 was designed for a defense security context. And there are some differences and important differences between what we saw, for example, with Russia, with tanks on the border, so obviously crossing into Ukraine's sovereign territory, and what we see the PRC do in an economic coercion scenario. One of the big differences is that economic coercion actions generally occur in a gray zone. They are by design not transparent. They are by design hidden. One example is we have seen a pattern whereby when Beijing decides to use trade relationships as a weapon, they very rarely, if ever, come out publicly and say, you know, Australia, for example, you know, we oppose you daring to call for an investigation into the origins of the COVID conflict. In response, we will block imports of your agricultural products. They don't say things like that. You know, instead, there will be a sudden discovery of phytosanitary problems in agricultural imports. Or in the Lithuania case, you know, somehow a certain nation will just disappear from the China's customs computer system, making it impossible to bring shipments across the border. Or, you know, as we've seen with companies, there will be a claim that Chinese consumers are just angry, and it's a coincidence that those companies are disappearing from centralized shopping portals in China. You know, there's very often some obfuscation of the tactics. It's very much gray zone tactics. Because of that, you know, anything that we can do to bring transparency to what is happening, to expose those tactics. You know, sunlight is always the best disinfectant. To help everyone understand exactly what's going on has great value. So I echo, you know, Ryuichi in stating that, you know, some of the proposals in the previous Asia Society paper about bringing transparency and sharing information about these tactics through the OECD or anywhere else would have high value. When it comes to actual deterrence, you know, Victor mentioned that the purpose is not to use it, but to threaten it. If we have to use it, that's a bit of a failure. In my view, we need to be prepared to use the tools we have for economic coercion. From the PRC's perspective, it is easier to find gray zone ways to obfuscate what they're doing in economic coercion. That's easier than it is to obfuscate that you are physically invading another country. And therefore, we should expect that this is going to keep happening. So whatever mechanism, whatever tools we have, we need to be prepared to use them and use them and use them again. And by using them and demonstrating that it's just not going to work, and by working with all of our allies and partners to make sure that everyone is more diverse and resilient on the front end, and that when this happens, ideally we can not only respond, but turn it into a good economic opportunity by helping nations pivot to new trading partners and new markets. In my view, the ideal scenario is one in which maybe Beijing keeps doing it, but it just becomes a non-event because everyone is more resilient and can vote with their feet and just pivot to other trading partners, and the coercion just doesn't work. Over.
Turn to Victor. Maybe Mariko, I could just ask you to respond, you know, to that point. Do you think that countries in the region are like willing to kind of stand up and work together to kind of counter some of these non-transparent measures by China, or that a country that's subject to coercion really wants to bring attention to the matter, fearing even further retribution from a country exercising coercion?
I think many countries will agree on that. Of course, many countries in all countries, excuse me, want to pursue their sovereignty and their interests. So of course, but then I think we have to keep in mind that even for the same measures, the cost might be different for many countries. And it's slightly different, but we are seeing, for example, the negotiation among the US, Japan, and Netherlands on semiconductor production equipment. At least for the information that's coming out, we are still not seeing any agreement. And let alone for middle-sized countries, think what they have to, in many cases, give up might be bigger than other countries. So I think they have to feel this, the confidence to act together is quite important to put the collective action forward.
I mean, Victor, let me turn it over to you to respond to some of Melanie's points, but also Mariko's point. You know, you're obviously know Korea probably better than anyone in Washington, and I look at, you know, the whole the THAAD you know, occurrence and all the economic coercion used against Korea, and I would just be interested in your perspective. Do you think Korea had confidence in us during those years that we were going to back them up?
The short answer is no. I don't think that they did. We've heard it. I think both you and I have heard it many times for Korean colleagues that the Koreans felt like they were out on an island, and at that time couldn't even get the U.S. government to demarche China on their economic coercion with Korea. I think we're in a completely different place now. You know, thanks to the work of Melanie and others in the U.S. government. Raising awareness about this, shining the light on it. I mean, there's much more awareness, and I say to my Korean colleagues every time they say, "Oh, well, you know, I don't know, should we join CHIPS 4? The Chinese might retaliate. Should we have a clause about Taiwan in our joint statement with Biden? No, the Chinese may retaliate." I tell them that 2016, 2017 is not 2023. That it's a very different time now, and that countries are much more aware of it. Again, going back to the earlier discussion, you know, all the things that have been described in terms of impact mitigation of China's economic coercion are exceptionally important. Like they must be done, whether it's in ad hoc coalitions or it's in G7 or it's in IPEF membership. I mean, it has to be done. And if it is so effective, if impact mitigation is so effective that the Chinese find, like, you know, we press this button and it just doesn't work anymore, then maybe they won't do it anymore. But for some reason, I don't think that's going to be the case. Like, I think impact mitigation will you know, address some of the problem. But in the end, as was said earlier, China will find some way. It will find some other instrument that it can use on a different product or a different investment, or, you know, whatever it might be, to continue to use this sort of gray zone tactic. And so the angle of this collective resilience argument is we should do all of that impact mitigation, but we should also think about having something else in our pocket that, you know, potentially has some bite to it, that China, if they press that button, they're going to feel some sort of pain, not just feel like it's not working, but also feel some sort of pain. And like I said, building a coalition like this is politically not easy at all, but it might be easier if we selected certain items to do this. Again, high dependence, low substitutability items. Again, it's not a liberal tactic, if you will, but as we know, the whole purpose of it is to try to get away from a situation where everybody accepts weaponization of interdependence as this sort of extant reality of the new trading order, right? That's what we're trying to avoid. The alternative is we don't do anything like this, and then China keeps using it, and nobody, I don't think anybody wants to see that.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and I welcome questions from the audience. Feel free to put them in the chat box or the Q&A box. Funatsu-san, over to you. I mean, now you're working on economic security in Tokyo. When you were in Washington, it was trade all the time. So you know tariffs and you know economic security. And I'd just be interested in your view, like, do you think there is a role for tariffs in responding to economic coercion, both offensively and defensively? Offensively, in line with kind of the Victor's thoughts about raising tariffs, or actually, imposing a ban or a prohibitive tariffs against China. But also we've heard in this space the notion of like lowering tariffs for products that are subject to coercion in third countries. In other words, if China was blocking the import of Australian barley, then the U.S. would either lower its tariff or would ease its quotas, et cetera, for a limited period of time. These, for trade people, these are hard things to get their hands around, but I'd just be interested in your perspective, given your kind of unique, different roles you've played with respect to trade and now economic security. And personal views are fine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wendy, for asking me that tough question. That's yes, international trade matters, international free trade matters, and maybe there are a lot of different roles of tariffs in that regard. But like Dr. Chow mentioned that in a way, if the tariffs could play a role in somehow sort of mitigating impact of the economic coercion, that could be somewhat, some people may argue that that could play an important role in mitigating the damages of economic coercions. But I would say that tariffs is probably not going to be the only option to be taken to mitigate the damages of economic coercions, and also more like mid-term and longer-term perspective is needed to enhance the supply chain resilience, the diversification of trade, etc., in preparing to address economic coercion in advance as well. But also, just speaking about the role of tariff on trade is always a tricky issue. So you really have to strike the best balance between the different interests. But yeah, that's probably the best I can tell as a personal view. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would just note, I believe it was about a year ago, when the United Steelworkers sent a letter, to the president and key cabinet officials, kind of questioning, if there is economic coercion and tariffs are going to be used as a tool, shouldn't that tool be used against the offending country and not to be used to lower tariffs? Because that has implications for U.S., domestic industries. So it's a complicated issue. My understanding is this current Coons-Young bill does provide tariff authority to be used both ways, but also provides and encourages other tools to be used, including coordinating and working with our allies and partners. Melanie, maybe I can ask you about kind of your views on the use of tariffs and anything you can say about the Coons-Young bill. Has the administration taken a position on it?
Thanks for the question. First of all, on the bill, we could not be more thrilled by the bipartisan support and interest from Congress. I think to Victor's point, 2023 is not 2016. I would say, having such tremendous bipartisan focus and support on these issues is really a game changer. So we're just thrilled to have that. And as Deputy Secretary Sherman mentioned in her testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about 2 weeks ago, we are also thrilled to be working very closely with the Hill on these issues generally. In terms of the tariff question, just two things. I will say that we have not yet seen a scenario where nations are coming to us saying that tariff changes would be the big fix. That hasn't been a really big, obvious ask. And so therefore, that isn't necessarily something that is at the forefront of the toolkit that we're thinking about. And then secondly, it's important to keep in mind that every individual nation is going to have different goods that are targeted in these cases. The United States isn't always going to be the best place to buy and transfer those goods. If you have a nation that has a particular agricultural product that's targeted, or a particular widget that's used as an intermediary product in a certain good, it may not be the United States that's the biggest market. It may not be the United States that's the end producer of the good and can necessarily buy the widgets. It may best be directed towards other markets. And so that's why I said that from a US government view, the ideal scenario is a jazz band response rather than an orchestra where you have a unified, every nation doing the same thing at the same time. In certain cases, US companies might be really well placed to step in and benefit. You know, if China walks away from a thriving, excellent place to do business like Lithuania, and we can get US companies and US goods in to fill the gap, great. We are always thrilled to do that. In other cases, it might just be that US businesses or US markets or goods aren't the best fit, but maybe Japanese ones are, or maybe European ones are. So we are really thinking about flexible responses, not necessarily something that's one size fits all, or that always depends on the US market or any individual tool. Over.
And I think here we really need to give kudos to you and others in the government, because this is a lot of work tailoring these kinds of responses and trying to figure out and consult with the targeted country about which tools would be the most effective. There's a great question from the audience, and that is, you know, we're talking about economic coercion, but you know, folks have accused the United States of economic coercion too. The question in the chat box questions whether our recent semiconductor export controls are a form of economic coercion. I will say that when we were drafting our Asia Society paper last year with the Perth Center in Australia, we did hear from folks about US economic coercive practices, particularly from some of our Mexican colleagues who felt that, and particularly during the Trump years, that the United States was practicing economic coercion. So does anyone want to take that? How do we distinguish between what China is doing and maybe some of the sanctions or other measures that the United States has taken against other countries?
Sure. So thank you for the question. Really appreciate, that's a good question.
I wasn't going to direct it to you, but thanks for volunteering.
Thrilled to answer this question. Look, you know, the United States sanctions have a clear legal basis. They are completely transparent. We are clear exactly who we are sanctioning, exactly why, exactly what the underlying law is for. If you look at who we are sanctioning, we sanction terrorists. We sanction human rights abusers. We sanction entities involved in the proliferation of mass destruction. In contrast, PRC sanctions or coercive actions are not transparent. There's no clear legal basis. There's no transparency about the entities or individuals that are being sanctioned or coerced. I mentioned that some of the economic coercion actions are called phytosanitary, right? I mean, there's always obfuscation. The United States sanctions terrorists. Beijing sanctions Japan, Australia, Lithuania, NGOs and companies who are speaking out for to share their own individual views. Just compare those two lists, and there's a really clear distinction.
Victor, anything you would like to add there?
I mean, I agree with everything that that Melanie just said. I think there are clear differences with regard to the particular issue of things like the semiconductor export controls. Again, I just come from this from a different perspective, so I don't see these things as illiberal trading practices. I see them as part of a broader U.S. great power peer competition strategy with China. that is not just in the economic space, security space, but also in the economic space. And I mean, to Melanie's point, it may be an export control, but it is very transparent. It's very clear, right? It's based in legislation. We know who the target is in that sense. So even in that sense, though, you know, sort of dyed-in-the-wool free traders might find it offensive. I still think that there's a difference there from what China does.
Mariko, let me direct the next audience question to you. And that is there's a question, you know, we've talked a lot about how countries that have been subject to coercion have worked hard on diversification, so they're less vulnerable to future acts of coercion. And I think you briefly mentioned that Japan has really worked on that with respect to critical minerals. But can you maybe elaborate on that, but also give us a sense, do these diversification efforts, you know, do they really work? And, you know, how many years does it take for a country to kind of reduce its dependence on countries? I mean, I think a lot will depend on whether you're talking about commodities or, you know, higher tech products, but any light you can shed on the impact and success of diversification efforts would be appreciated.
I think, of course, the diversification works. It's the typical investment strategy too. The more you diversify in general, you're taking less risk. So I think it absolutely works. But I think how long it takes, of course, it comes down to how many suppliers are out there. So you can see, for example, Japan's example from 90% reliance to 60%, a success, of course. And if you see that,
and that was for critical minerals, the 90 to 60.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then it is a hard fact that it's still relying 60%. So it's the question of, are you going to see the half full or half empty? And I think, like I said at the initial question, I don't think it's, I mean, of course, diversification is important, but it is not the only way. So, like, for example, we can see the improvement of technology, and utilizing the technology might be helpful too. So, of course, it works, and it is important to work on that too, but that is not the only solution, or that's necessary, but that's not enough, I would say.
Funatsu, over to you. Just anything more you can tell us on your 7-year with respect to supply chain diversification and just, you know, some of these broader economic security issues beyond coercion. How important are they going to be when we read the leader's statement? Are we going to see some new initiatives here, or this conversation taken further?
Yes, thank you so much for speaking about our own domestic efforts to diversify our supply chains based on the Economic Security Promotion Bill. We've been having a lot of initiative for the better supply chain diversifications right now. But when it comes to international front, like you said, G7, the G7 framework has addressed the supply chain questions back in 2021 UK summit and Elma summit last year as well. So we have some sort of sequence of discussions on supply chain resilience, in particular critical minerals. So we are, of course, sort of following up on the what has been discussed on the supply chain questions this year as well. So we are aiming to advance our cooperation among G7 members to address the supply chain questions, including diversifications. But since the supply chains are really broad terminologies, and it really depends what kind of commodity you talk about, what kind of commodity supply chains you want to address, etc. But so the discussions are ongoing, but I can't predict the outcome of the summit meeting at this stage, but still we are tackling with this important issue. Thank you.
So we have just a few minutes left, and maybe then I could just ask the remaining 3 speakers just to comment on, what would you like to see come out in the G7 on this matter this year? Or, what kind of progress would you like to see just more generally be made, on this matter this year? Maybe Victor, I can turn to you first, then Melanie, then Mariko.
Sure. Well, so I think all the things that have been discussed in terms of potential agenda items for the G7 are all very good. Again, you would not be surprised to say that I would like to see at least some sort of discussion about a strategy that complements or supplements impact mitigation and resilience, that looked at how G7 members could cooperate in terms of signaling some form of collective economic deterrence. As I said, if you look at the G7 countries, they have 403 items they export to China that are high dependence, greater than 70%. Greater than 70%, just for listeners, viewers, Chinese dependence on Australian iron ore is like 56%, 58%. So 70% is a pretty high number. And some of these are like probably meaningless, like China is nearly 100% dependent on Japanese ballpoint pens, which they could probably find substitutes for. But there are a number of luxury good items where they are nearly 100% dependent on G7 countries, and then other intermediary strategic items that could cause some pain for China. So it's just something I'd like to see a discussion about. Obviously, it's way too early for governments to actually coordinate with companies and with other governments around a strategy, but I'd love to see some discussion of that.
So in short, the word deterrence, you'll be looking for that.
Yes, exactly.
Melanie, over to you.
Sure. So I can't comment on any specific G7 discussions underway, other than to say that from a U.S. government perspective, we are thrilled with the leadership that Japan is showing this year in the G7. We're thrilled to be supporting Tokyo and working together with Ryuichi and his colleagues who are doing a really tremendous job on this issue. And, in terms of economic coercion, our door is already open. The United States is here, and we are thrilled to have conversations with nations who may be facing economic coercion or may be considering actions that they fear could trigger economic coercion. Our door is open now. We recognize that some countries or economies appreciate public support and engagement. We recognize that others may prefer things to be more quiet, and we are entirely flexible in this regard. The United States cannot promise any particular kind of economic assistance in advance when nations are considering actions in their own sovereign interests, but we are always thrilled to have a quiet discussion and to engage on this issue. So our door is open now. We are open for business, and we welcome a discussion with anyone who's concerned about this issue. Over.
That's great. Mariko, the final word.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Wendy. Excuse me. I would like to see this development and discussion towards the collective action too. And I think it's the time to recognize the difference among in terms of economic structure and economic industrial structure, because that's where we can start adjusting and come up with the common ground, and where we agree on what we are willing to sacrifice in terms of whether that's sales or market. So I would like to see further discussion around there. Thank you.
Well, with that, Ryuichi, and you and your team have your work cut out for you. And I'm sure, well, to this panel, economic coercion is extremely important. I'm sure there are a lot of other important issues on the G7 agenda. So we hope you get some sleep between now and the leaders meeting. And to Victor, Melanie, and Mariko, and you too, Ryuichi, thank you so much for spending the time with us. Thanks to the audience for joining us. I got to as many questions as I could, but I think you'd all agree that this panel did an excellent job in really kind of parsing through the issues that are associated with this growing challenge to the international rules-based system, as well as to stability in the region. So thank you very much. Everyone have a great day. For our friends in Asia, have a good evening. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.